Golden Age stars who secretly hid deformities and disabilities. In Hollywood's Golden Age, perfection wasn't just a desire. It was the law of survival. A single flaw exposed, no matter how small, could erase a career overnight. That's why some stars had to live their entire lives behind a flawless mask, hiding the truth with the most sophisticated tactics. In today's list, some risked their lives filming dangerous scenes where one wrong move could mean instant death. And some carried within them an illness that Hollywood would do anything to conceal. These secrets were buried for decades, allowing audiences to believe they were absolutely perfect. But when the truth comes to light, will you be ready to accept the cracks behind their shining facade? Marilyn Monroe, the body secret that made her beg to keep acting. In the mid-1950s, when Hollywood shone like a diamond crown, the name placed on its brightest gem was Marilyn Monroe. All of America adored her, from her sunlit smile, platinum hair to those curves that challenged every gaze. But behind that glamour was a truth the studios at the time kept as tightly guarded as a state secret. Marilyn was not the flawless Venus statue seen on screen. She was born with a slight foot deformity, which sometimes caused her walk to be a bit uneven. In everyday life, it wasn't a big problem. But in Hollywood, where every millimeter of the body was scrutinized under the lights, this was a flaw that wasn't allowed to exist. Producers made Marilyn spend hours practicing poses, twisting her body to the point of pain so that every step before the camera would be perfect. More painfully, she suffered from endometriosis, with stabbing abdominal pains striking without warning, even in the middle of a scene. On one occasion, right after the director called cut, Marilyn had to grip the wall tightly, sweat soaking through her makeup, but the assistant only whispered, "You have to keep going, they're waiting out there." Marilyn's entire career was a dance between seduction and pain. Glamorous dresses, flashing lights, on-screen kisses, all became a mask, hiding a fragile body and a weary heart. And when news of her death at 36 exploded like a bomb, the world was shocked. But those who had worked with her only whispered to each other, "We pushed her too far." Next, the cowboy king, John Wayne, will show you the extraordinary strength of a man who lost part of his body, yet still became an immortal icon of American cinema. John Wayne lost a lung, but still dominated the silver screen. If Hollywood had an unbeatable figure, it was John Wayne, a man nearly 6'4", with a deep voice and the stance of a horseman riding tall across the western desert. But few knew that behind the image of the rugged cowboy was a body missing a vital part for survival. In 1964, John Wayne underwent hours of surgery to remove an entire lung and 2 ribs after being diagnosed with cancer. At that time, for an action star to lose the power of a lung, it was considered a career death sentence. But Wayne refused to accept that. Less than a year later, he was back on set, riding horses, firing guns, and engaging in hand-to-hand fights without a stunt double. On screen, audiences still saw Wayne stride firmly through sandstorms, but off-screen, he had to learn to breathe deeply, using only his remaining lung. In one long scene, filmed at high altitude, Wayne nearly passed out from lack of oxygen. Yet he only signaled to the cameraman, "Keep going, we're almost there." John Wayne never hid his illness. On the contrary, he openly fought cancer, appearing in public to urge people to get early screenings. And it was this image of a cowboy who was both strong and willing to face death that made Wayne a legend beyond the silver screen. Elizabeth Taylor, rare violet eyes, and a string of life-threatening surgeries. If the eyes are the windows to the soul, then Elizabeth Taylor's eyes were like two violet gems, unlike anything Hollywood had seen before. A beauty so rare that scientists called it a super-rare recessive gene found in only a few people worldwide. But those mesmerizing eyes belonged to a body far more fragile than the public imagined. From birth, Elizabeth suffered from a congenital heart condition and scoliosis. As a child, she often spent months bedridden from pain and complications. Doctors once advised her family to limit her physical activity, but then Hollywood called her name. When stepping under the bright studio lights, Elizabeth never allowed herself to appear weak. In glamorous gowns, she stood tall, proud, hiding the stiff back brace beneath. On days when filming dance scenes, every spin felt like a knife cutting into her spine, yet she still smiled as if nothing was wrong. That fragile body endured dozens of surgeries throughout her life, including major heart surgery. Many recalled that just days after a serious operation, Elizabeth appeared on the red carpet, flawlessly made up, ready to face dozens of camera flashes. It was this contrast between goddess beauty and a delicate body that created the legend of Elizabeth Taylor, a woman Hollywood worshipped, but who spent her entire life in the arms of illness. And if Elizabeth Taylor's story moved you, then the next figure, James Dean, will show you the fragility of youth when a star had only just begun to shine, only to be extinguished in a single fateful moment. James Dean, living with both vision and hearing impairments. In the mid-1950s, when the image of the rebel youth began to explode on American screens, James Dean appeared like a blazing blue flame. With only 3 films, Rebel Without a Cause, East of Eden, and Giant, he became the symbol of an entire generation. But few knew that from a young age, Dean had lived with 2 impairments that Hollywood never publicly revealed. He was severely nearsighted, almost unable to clearly distinguish other people's faces if they stood a few meters away. On top of that, a teenage accident had left Dean partially deaf in his left ear. This meant that on set, he had to memorize his co-stars' positions and read lips to avoid missing lines. In many high-speed scenes, especially driving sequences, Dean was almost acting by guessing directions and relying on instinct. Perhaps it was these limitations that created Dean's signature distant gaze and detached demeanor, something audiences saw as part of his artistic essence. But in truth, it was the result of his constant mental strain to fill in the gaps in his vision and hearing. On September 30th, 1955, James Dean drove his Porsche 550 Spyder along a California highway. A curve, another car appeared, And just seconds later, Hollywood lost the 24-year-old star the world had been watching. His sudden passing made Dean's legend immortal, but the secrets of his body would forever remain in the memories of those who had been by his side. Audrey Hepburn health, ravaged since wartime. When Audrey Hepburn appeared on the silver screen, people thought she had stepped out of a dream. Doe-like eyes, a slender figure, and a gentle smile that could melt the world. But that delicate appearance stemmed from the harshest years of her life. Audrey's childhood was marked by war. At just 11 years old, she lived in Nazi-occupied Holland. Food was so scarce that she survived on tulip bulbs and wild grass. Those years left her severely malnourished. Her height developed, but her body remained thin, her immune system weak, and she carried long-term stomach damage for life. Even after becoming a star in Breakfast at Tiffany's and Roman Holiday, Audrey often suffered stomach pains and exhaustion between takes. Yet audiences never saw her complain. Instead, she turned her fragility into a new standard of beauty, so different from the voluptuous curves of the era. She once said, "The beauty of a woman is not in a facial mode, but the true beauty in a woman is reflected in her soul." Perhaps that's why, despite her frail health, Audrey shone brighter than any spotlight, not only in film, but also in her humanitarian work later in life. Paul Newman, colorblind but still drove race cars and performed stunts. With eyes as blue as a summer lake and a mischievous smile, Paul Newman was the kind of man who could make all of Hollywood envious. Audiences loved him for his charismatic roles in Cool Hand, Luke the Hustler and Butch Cassidy, and the Sundance Kid. But off-screen Newman was also a skilled race car driver, frequently competing in high-speed events. What few knew, Paul Newman was born colorblind. He couldn't clearly distinguish certain colors, a serious disadvantage in the world of racing where misreading a signal could lead to a fatal accident in an instant. Track lights, warning flags. To Newman, they sometimes appeared only as indistinct patches of color. Instead of quitting, Newman learned to outsmart his limits. He memorized every corner and braking point, relying entirely on the feel of the steering wheel, the sound of the engine, and the vibrations of the car to know when to accelerate or slow down. Teammates recalled that Newman drove as if he had radar in his head. Even more astonishing, at age 70, he stood on the winner's podium at the 24 Hours of Daytona, becoming one of the oldest drivers to claim victory. For Newman, colorblindness wasn't a barrier. It was the reason to prove that speed belongs to the heart, and courage, not just the eyes. And if Paul Newman has earned your admiration, then Shan Connory, the legendary 007 agent, will show you how sometimes a physical imperfection can make an image even more untouchable. Shan Connory, the classic James Bond deaf in one ear since his Navy days. When Shan Connory first donned the tuxedo and uttered "Bond, James Bond" in 1962, the world had found a secret agent so perfect it seemed impossible to exist in real life. But behind that cool, invincible image, Connery carried an unexpected impairment. During his service in the Royal Navy, Connory suffered a severe injury to his right ear. The result was total hearing loss on that side. This meant that on set, he could only hear from one direction, a serious disadvantage in action scenes that required quick reflexes. Co-stars recalled that Connory often adjusted his standing position to hear lines better or discreetly read lips in crowded scenes. Yet audiences never noticed. On screen, he still caught the sound of gunfire, heard footsteps from afar, and struck before his enemies could react pure 007. Connory never considered his hearing loss a weakness. He once said, "If you focus on what's left, you won't have time to dwell on what's lost." Perhaps it was that focus that made him not only the first James Bond, but also the most iconic Bond in the hearts of millions. Steve McQueen, the king of cool, battled cancer, suspected to be caused by asbestos on film sets. In the 1960s-70s, no one could touch Steve McQueen's title as the King of Cool. From Bullet to The Great Escape, he was the embodiment of defiance, speed, and danger. McQueen drove in his own chase scenes, performed his own motorcycle jumps, turning every action sequence into an unforgettable moment. But, right at the peak of his career, an invisible enemy quietly emerged. In 1979, McQueen was diagnosed with mesothelioma, a rare form of lung cancer almost always linked to asbestos exposure. And the trail of clues led back to his years on film sets. In war and action films, McQueen often wore protective suits and worked in environments containing asbestos, something no one at the time considered dangerous. The cruelty of mesothelioma is that it shows no mercy. By the time it was detected, the disease was already in its late stage. McQueen did not surrender. He threw himself into every possible treatment, including controversial therapies in Mexico. Friends said that even as his health deteriorated, McQueen kept his signature cool smile and joked, "I've escaped every explosion, but maybe not this time." On November 7th, 1980, Steve McQueen passed away at the age of 50. The world lost its king of cool, but was left with a haunting question. Had Hollywood inadvertently killed one of its greatest icons? Kirk Douglas' severe spinal injury. Kirk Douglas, star of Spartacus, was the classic Hollywood model of a man of steel, a warrior on screen and off. But in 1991, he faced a moment he himself called the touch of death. Douglas was sitting in a small helicopter with two of the other passengers when it collided mid-air with a small plane. The helicopter crashed to the ground, killing the other two instantly. Douglas survived, but the impact left him with a severe spinal injury and lasting pain. Doctors advised complete rest, even limiting the time he could stand. But Douglas refused. Just months after the accident, he returned to the set standing tall, his face still radiating that proud charisma. On screen, no one could tell he was carrying sharp pains in his spine. For Douglas, survival was not just luck. It was a reminder to make the most of every remaining moment. The accident didn't take away his aura. It only made the legend of Spartacus more immortal. Ray Miland had to read lips to act because he couldn't hear. Ray Miland once won an Oscar for The Lost Weekend. But many American audiences over 50 remember him for his roles as officers, pilots, and adventure heroes in countless war, western, and detective films. Few knew Miland had battled a silent disability throughout his career, having lost nearly all hearing in one ear. The injury occurred while serving in the Royal Air Force due to exposure to explosions and high-intensity jet engine noise. As a result, on set, Miland could only hear clearly from one side. In action scenes, especially shooting or flying sequences, this meant he had to judge the direction of sounds almost entirely with his eyes and instincts. To hide it, Miland mastered lip reading to perfection, allowing him to interact seamlessly with co-stars without revealing any weakness. Even in scenes with loud noise or distant camera setups, he still delivered his lines smoothly, as if hearing every word. That determination earned Miland not only the admiration of audiences, but also the trust of directors to take on dangerous scenes where a single mistake could be fatal. And until the end of his career, few knew that one of cinema's heroes had often been acting in near silence. But if Ray Miland chose to remain silent about his disability, Rock Hudson lived with another kind of secret one that only came to light in his final days, shaking both Hollywood and America. Rock Hudson hid HIV/AIDS until he was near death. Standing at 6'4", with a handsome face and a warm smile, Rock Hudson was once the dream man of millions of American women. From magnificent obsession to pillow talk, he was the epitome of romance and sophistication, the man Hollywood promoted as the perfect masculine ideal. Yet behind the glamorous lights was a secret Hudson carried for nearly his entire career. In 1984, he was diagnosed with HIV at a time when the disease was surrounded by fear, stigma, and heavy prejudice. Hudson continued acting and appearing in public, but kept the diagnosis private, telling only a few close friends. This secret was revealed in July 1985 when Hudson appeared in Paris thin and frail and officially announced he had AIDS. The news immediately shocked not only the entertainment industry but also American society, which still viewed HIV/AIDS as a death sentence tied to deep social biases. Rock Hudson died in October that year at the age of 59. His passing became a turning point, opening public conversations about HIV/AIDS in the United States. From a romantic star, Hudson became a symbol of courage in confronting a disease the world still shunned at the time. Rita Hworth, forced to change her appearance and hid Alzheimer's disease. Rita Hworth, the love goddess of 1940s Hollywood, once captivated the world with her sultry eyes and fiery dance in Gilda. On screen, she was the embodiment of perfection. But behind the scenes was a series of times when Hollywood recreated who she was. When she first signed with the studio, Rita, then using her birth name, Cancino, was forced to completely change her image, dyeing her hair a vivid red, raising her hairline to make her forehead higher, even retraining how she walked and spoke. She accepted it, all transforming herself into a new icon, but also carrying invisible scars in her soul. Even sadder, in the late 1970s, Rita began developing Alzheimer's disease at a time when the illness was little understood. Her early symptoms were mistaken by the public as heavy drinking tarnishing her image. It was only in 1981, when her daughter revealed her condition, that people learned the goddess was actually battling an invisible enemy erasing her memory. Rita Hworth died in 1987, but her story made America pay more attention to Alzheimer's. From a star forced to meet Hollywood's standards to a woman misunderstood because of illness, Rita left behind a legacy beyond her films, one of compassion and public awareness. And if Rita Hworth had to live with the disease that ate away at her memory, Gary Cooper, Hollywood's gentleman cowboy, spent his final years battling searing back pain and a silent cancer. Gary Cooper acted through severe back pain and cancer. Gary Cooper, the symbol of integrity and rugged charm, enthralled American audiences in High Noon, Sergeant York, and countless westerns. He always appeared with an unhurried stride, steady gaze, and an aura of unshakable calm. But in truth, every step Cooper took on set came with pain so intense he had to grit his teeth to endure it. For years, Cooper suffered from chronic back injuries, the result of horseback riding falls and performing his own action scenes without a stunt double. He often needed painkiller injections right before filming. In High Noon, when audiences saw him walking slowly with a contemplative look, you realized part of it was because his back hurt so badly he could barely breathe. The tragedy didn't end there. In 1960, Cooper was diagnosed with prostate cancer, which later spread to his lungs and bones. At the time, Hollywood and the press often stayed silent about a star's illness, and Cooper chose not to go public. He continued to appear in public, smiling and charming as ever, as if nothing was wrong. By 1961, when the disease had reached its final stage, Cooper finally admitted, "I will not be back to the set again." Just a few months later, he died at the age of 60. Audiences remembered him as the hero of the West, but few knew that many of those unbreakable roles were built on a foundation of unending physical pain. Humphrey Bogart still acting while battling late-stage esophageal cancer. In 1956, at the very height of his legendary career, Humphrey Bogart received news that cut through his life like a knife: esophageal cancer. By the time it was discovered, the disease was already in its late stage. He had lost nearly 15 kilograms, and his voice, once his most seductive weapon, had grown hoarse and labored. Every meal became a battle with his own body, as the tumor made swallowing excruciating. Doctors advised him to leave the set rest and prepare for the worst. But Bogart merely shrugged. "If I stop acting, it means I'm already dead." And so, despite the pain, he walked into every scene with the same calm, collected demeanor that audiences knew so well. On screen, viewers saw only Rick Blaine, cool and detached, lighting a cigarette with a half smile. They had no idea that each drag seared his throat so badly it brought tears to his eyes. For nearly 2 decades, Bogart redefined the image of a man on screen. No need for perfect looks or flowery dialogue, just eyes that told stories and a truth that cut to the bone. Even after undergoing surgery to remove part of his esophagus, he refused to take on easier roles. For Bogart, a role had to be a challenge, or it wasn't worth doing. On January 14, 1957, Humphrey Bogart died at the age of 57. His funeral drew almost the entire upper echelon of Hollywood at the time. Katherine Hepburn, his co-star and closest friend, said something that left everyone choking back tears. He left the way he lived, never letting anything dim his style. Charlton Heston, hiding Alzheimer's for many years. On August 9, 2002, Charlton Heston stepped up to a podium in a room packed with reporters. He smiled, his eyes still carrying the same confidence as when he held the reins in Ben-Hur, but his voice was slow, as if he was trying to hold on to every word. And then he spoke the sentence that made the whole world fall silent. "I have been diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease." It was one of the rare moments the public saw Heston admit weakness. For years prior, he had quietly lived with the disease that was eroding his memory and his ability to speak. Close friends recalled that on set, he sometimes had to write his lines on paper or rely on a discreet prompt whispered through an earpiece. But audiences never suspected. They only saw a mighty Moses in the Ten Commandments, an indomitable Ben-Hur in the Roman arena, or an unyielding warrior in El Cid. Hollywood is notoriously unforgiving of any sign of frailty, especially in its leading men who embody strength. Heston understood that better than anyone. He kept taking roles, still stood in front of the camera, relying on the muscle memory built over decades to cover the growing gaps in his mind. When he chose to go public, Heston wasn't seeking pity. He wanted to turn his story into a call for awareness about Alzheimer's, a disease still hidden away by many families out of shame at the time. The image of Ben-Hur facing the truth head-on became one of the most courageous moments in Hollywood history. Ingrid Bergman, fighting cancer while enduring a scandal that shook the world. Ingrid Bergman, the woman with the deep, soulful eyes and a voice that lulled audiences in Casablanca, was once revered by both Hollywood and Europe as a goddess of the silver screen. But behind the glamour, she weathered two fierce storms, a devastating illness, and a love scandal that nearly erased her name from every American cinema. In 1949, at the peak of her career, Bergman fell in love with Italian filmmaker Roberto Rossellini and became pregnant while still married to Dr. Peter Lindstrom. In the conservative moral climate of the time, this was like a nuclear bomb detonating in Hollywood. The U.S. Senate even publicly condemned her, calling Bergman a moral threat and demanding that all her films be banned in America. Overnight, she went from Budandel to the most hated woman in the country. But Ingrid Bergman refused to bow her head. She left America, continued to act in Europe, and slowly regained respect through her undeniable talent. By 1950s, she returned to Hollywood with Anastasia and won an Oscar, a sweet slap in the face to those who had tried to bury her, just when audiences thought nothing could bring Bergman down. She was diagnosed with breast cancer in the late 1970s. For years, she kept acting, taking stage roles, and concealing the toll of chemotherapy. In her final film, A Woman Called Golda, 1982, she shot major scenes just months before her death with one arm nearly paralyzed from complications. On August 29, 1982, Ingrid Bergman died in London on her 67th birthday. From a goddess felled by scandal to a woman who fought disease, until her last breath, Bergman left behind a legacy of pride, talent, and defiance in the face of judgment. If Bergman had once been brought down by public scandal, then Montgomery Clift was struck by fate itself, a fate that disfigured his face and turned that pain into an acting weapon that silenced Hollywood. Montgomery Clift car crash that disfigured his face. On the night of May 12, 1956, after an evening at Elizabeth Taylor's Beverly Hills mansion, Montgomery Clift drove home. Just minutes after leaving the party, his car slammed into a telephone pole. The crash echoed down the empty street, glass exploding like fireworks. Elizabeth Taylor, upon hearing the news, sped to the scene. The image she saw would haunt her forever. Clift's face covered in blood, jaw shattered, teeth broken, and blood pouring from his mouth. Some say Taylor reached into his mouth to remove the broken teeth, saving him from choking to death. Before the accident, Montgomery Clift was one of Hollywood's golden trio, alongside Marlon Brando and James Dean, the embodiment of masculine beauty tinged with fragility. But in an instant, the crash erased that image. His once perfect face was now scarred, partially paralyzed on one side, and even his voice had changed. Most stars in Clift's position would have disappeared from the screen, but he refused to vanish. Clift returned to set just months later, taking on intense, emotionally heavy roles like Raintree County and Judgment at Nuremberg. Directors used lighting and camera angles to hide his disfigurement, but Clift embraced it, channeling the change into his characters, damaged, yearning, and profoundly deep. Critics called his post-accident work After Death, acting as though Clift had died once and been reborn as a different actor, raw, more exposed. But the cost was isolation, alcoholism, and a body that steadily gave way. Montgomery Clift died in 1966 at the age of 45, alone in his apartment with a script lying unfinished beside his bed. Friends called him the greatest actor Hollywood didn't know how to keep. If Clift turned pain into art, then Katherine Hepburn turned a congenital hand tremor into part of her signature, transforming a flaw into something that made her impossible to mistake for anyone else. Katherine Hepburn, turning her illness into a signature acting style. Katherine Hepburn, the queen of American cinema, had a career spanning more than 60 years and 4 Academy Awards, a record that remains unbeaten to this day. She was famous for her strong personality, her habit of dressing like a gentleman, and her refusal to conform to the feminine standards Hollywood tried to impose. But few knew that Hepburn lived her entire life with a condition that made her hands tremble uncontrollably. The tremors appeared when she was young, and over time became more pronounced. In close-up shots, her hands often trembled slightly, sometimes causing the glass or teacup she held to sway. For many actors, this would have been a death sentence for their career, but Hepburn turned it into her style. She learned to make the trembling movements appear natural, even adding depth to her characters. Intelligent, strong women who were anything but perfect. Cinematographers and directors once asked if she wanted to hide this flaw. Hepburn simply laughed. "Why hide it? This is me." And indeed, those trembling hands, together with her sharp voice and defiant gaze, became trademarks that made her impossible to confuse with any other star. Behind that confidence was an extraordinary willpower. Hepburn never took time off from acting because of her condition, even when the tremors made precise actions difficult. She only said one simple sentence: "People hire me because I'm Katherine Hepburn. And Katherine Hepburn has trembling hands." Errol Flynn, born with a heart condition, still performed dangerous battle and adventure scenes. The ship's deck shook violently. Swords flashed under the studio lights. Errol Flynn leaped from the mast, landed in the middle of a group of enemies, and swung his sword, scattering them all. The director's shout of "Cut!" echoed, and the crew broke into thunderous applause. Everyone believed Flynn had just pulled off one of the most spectacular action sequences in The Seahawk. But minutes later, in a corner of the set, Flynn collapsed into a chair, clutching his chest, breathing heavily, as if he had just swum against a raging current. It was a rare moment when he revealed his secret: a congenital weak heart. Since his teenage years, doctors had warned him to avoid overexertion and strong excitement. Yet Flynn chose the exact opposite path, becoming Hollywood's ultimate swashbuckling adventure star. He refused stunt doubles for ship deck jumps, galloping horseback chases, or long sword duels, any of which could have stopped his heart instantly. Friends said Flynn often relied on strong liquor to get his courage up before action scenes, not because he feared the danger, but because it calmed his pounding, erratic heartbeat. Yet on screen, audiences only saw a dashing Robin Hood who never lost a fight. Ultimately, his indulgent lifestyle and an unannounced heart attack brought Flynn's journey to an end in 1959, when he was only 50. But the images of him laughing defiantly in a rain of arrows or charging into enemies on a ship's deck still make people believe Robin Hood's heart never gave up. Gregory Peck, enduring severe back pain to keep acting. In 12 O'Clock High, Gregory Peck led a squadron of bombers through torrents of enemy fire step by step, becoming the embodiment of American courage. Audiences only saw a fearless commander, eyes blazing. They didn't know that under the immaculate uniform lay a small steel armor strapped around his back, the only thing keeping him standing through searing pain. Peck had suffered a spinal injury in his youth after a serious fall from a horse. Doctors had warned, you won't be able to handle high-speed horseback riding or heavy lifting. But Hollywood wanted him to gallop across prairies, carry rifles through trenches, and charge headfirst into every stunt in westerns and war films. From the big country to Duel in the Sun, he said yes to it all, then paid the price each night, lying motionless for hours, sweat pouring from the agony. Once, during a scene riding across a mountainside, a sudden jolt nearly knocked him unconscious in the saddle. The crew thought Peck was just acting with deep intensity, but in reality, he was struggling not to fall. When the director yelled, "Cut!" he simply adjusted his hat and smiled. If we're still rolling, I'm still alive. Peck never used his illness to demand special treatment. He quietly wore his protective armor, gritted his teeth, and preserved the image of the perfect screen hero. And audiences never knew that even in his most glorious moments, he was fighting not just fictional enemies, but his own body. The spotlight can make us believe in absolute perfection. But the truth is, no one walks through life without scars. The stars you saw today sacrificed health, years of life, and sometimes even dignity, just to maintain the illusion of flawlessness on camera. And perhaps the most thought-provoking thing is they succeeded in hiding it for decades, until the secrets were exposed. So, what about you? If you discovered your idol had a flaw, would you admire them more, or feel deceived? Leave a comment to share your thoughts.